One of the great things about a 3D scene is you're not limited by the physical reality. Almost anything is possible, and we can move our camera anywhere. However, this is one of the problems. Because we're not limited by the physical reality, it's really easy to move your camera in an unbelievable way. But if you know a little bit about how things are done in the real world, it's really going to help your project look better. So before you start your animated project, let's learn some of the basics about camera moves. Here's a model of a camera. If it's unrestrained, we have what's called 6 degrees of freedom. That is, it can move, or I'll use the term translate, on its 3 axes, and it can also rotate on those same 3 axes. That gives us 6 degrees of freedom, which is also called 6 degrees of motion. Now, each one of these moves has a technical name. If you translate your camera forward and backwards, that is called a dolly. Side to side is called a truck. Up and down is called a pedestal. If you rotate to the left and the right, that is called a pan. If you rotate up and down, that is called a tilt. And if you rotate from the side, that is called a roll. So that's our 6 degrees of movement. Dolly, truck, pedestal, pan, tilt, roll. Now that you know the technical names, you can actually start using them and sound like a professional, rather than what you used to call each one of these moves. Now let's talk about some of the different types of mounts a camera can be attached to. A mount will restrict all or some of the camera's actual movements. Now the first mount is no mount at all. This is handheld, where the camera is held by a person, giving it all those 6 degrees of motion, and it's often intentionally shaky, which is something quite hard to do in 3D, but we'll have a look at that a little bit later on in the course. Now probably the most common mount would be a tripod, and that restricts most of the movement, and it just allows the camera to pan or tilt. Everything else is generally locked off. And getting more fancy, we have a dolly camera, also known as a dolly rig or a dolly. This is often put on a track so that we can get smooth movement as people push the camera along the track. Yes, people do push it manually, but it doesn't have to go on a track. It can actually just go on the ground as well. One of the coolest mounts would probably be the Steadicam, which you can see here is held by one of the CG Cookie creators, Jonathan Williamson. It's actually not Jonathan, but it looks a lot like him. Now, Steadicam actually just smooths out the movement, so the person is free to run around and point the camera wherever, but it just does its best to stabilize the view. Here is a shot of a crane or a boom rig. This is where the camera is mounted on the end of the crane, so it can get some height. These generally move in a nice arc. And of course, cameras can actually be mounted to many different things that I haven't mentioned here, like drones, helicopters, to get aerial shots. On this guy on a Segway, you can mount them to people or a helmet, or even cars or vehicles. You've probably seen dash cams. Some people actually get creative out there by putting a camera on a skateboard or this tripod rollerblade contraption thing here. It's not possible for me to explain all the different types of mount, and that's not the main point of what I want to explain in this video. What I want you to do is anytime that you need to move your camera in a 3D project, I want you to think about what it's actually mounted on and how that thing is going to move. If you do that, you are going to get a much better result than just trying to animate it in the scene without thinking about it. Now there's 2 more things I want to talk about, and that is zoom and focus, which aren't technically moves, although they could be, but they are camera techniques. Firstly, the rack focus. That is where we change the focus of the camera to draw the viewer's eye to something that we want them to pay attention to. That is a rack focus. Then we have a zoom. Now zooming is where the camera stays still and the focal length changes to zoom in or out on the shot. We'll go more into focal length and what it is later on. But the most famous type of zoom is the dolly zoom, which is also called a Hitchcock zoom. This is where we move the camera and we zoom at the same time. I'll show you how to do this later on in the course, so look forward to that. One other type of zoom is the crash zoom, which is often used in comedy or action when it's a really fast-paced zoom to accentuate a certain point. Okay, so that's enough for this lesson for the moment. But before we finish up, I'd like to give you some homework. You're going to like this homework. What I want you to do is watch a movie, a film, a TV, or whatever. And all I want you to do is look for a shot or a scene where the camera is moving, pause it, and then think about how that was physically done. Noticing these camera moves and trying to think about how they did them in the real world is really going to help you make those in 3D. Okay, I'll see you in the next lesson.